So today's session, as I mentioned, is on that challenge of saying no in a firm but friendly way, and setting boundaries, particularly as a physician and leader. And today, it's been a while, but today we're actually back in our leads in a caring environment work, and in this domain, it falls under lead self. Okay, so I just wanted to start things off with a quick poll. And the scenario for this poll is a longtime patient has asked you to take on a relative. And you've explained that your panel is closed, but they become upset and persist saying that they're desperate. So of the poll answers, which one best fits for you? I'm just going to launch that here. You should see it on your screen. Okay. All right, so I'm going to end the poll here and share the results with you. So you can see about 18% say they stand their ground and feel okay with it. About 14% still decline but feel bad and it impacts the rest of their day. About 39% decline but do some extra work to help them find someone. And about 29%, about a third of the group, agrees to take on the relative because saying no is hard. And that's, I think, a pretty common. All right. Here we go. So it sounds like there's definitely some challenge out there with saying no, even if you are doing it, you still feel kind of uncomfortable with it. And that makes sense. And for today's session, we're definitely going to talk about some of the practical tips for things you can try. And I'm sure our physicians out there have lots of your own tried and true methods that you'll get a chance to share when we move into the breakout rooms. We're going to talk about a few that maybe you have or haven't heard or tried before, perhaps something new you can explore. But we're going to start today by exploring a bit about why we tend to have trouble saying no and setting boundaries before we get to the practical stuff. And, a couple times in the past, we've talked about the primitive part of our brain, the limbic system, and specifically the amygdala. And that's where threat is perceived. And its goal is to keep us safe, and it's the center for emotion. Whereas our prefrontal cortex is where we regulate that emotion, and it modulates those alarm bells that the limbic system sets up. So when we feel threatened, our bodies respond just like they did when we frequently encountered wild animals as primitive humans, and we go into survival mode. But the difference now is in our modern lives, the threats are more often people than wild animals. And our amygdala perceives someone being upset with us as an existential threat. And I know that sounds dramatic, but the amygdala actually is very dramatic. And its goal is to keep us safe. So when the amygdala triggers, the response varies from lashing out in fight mode to avoiding the situation and just leaving in flight mode. And flight mode can also look like fidgeting or shuffling because our conscious mind is trying to keep us from running away. So there's a bit of a push-pull going on in our brain. And when our subconscious doesn't think fighting or fleeing are options, it may cause us to go into freeze mode. In this case, the stress response causes us to feel kind of stuck in place. And on the exterior, we may look disengaged, but internally there's a full stress response going on. And what might look like being kind of a silent jerk is actually someone whose brain is in full amygdala hijack and they really can't think straight enough to respond. They're just frozen. Now, some experts have added a fourth response called fawn. We talked about this quite a few sessions ago, I think, but fawning means doing or saying anything to de-escalate things. So it looks like being overly agreeable or putting your own needs aside, or sometimes saying yes when no would be the better answer. So why do we do this? Dr. Carl Albrecht developed this model that shows the 5 primordial fears that we all universally experience. And he aligned them in this hierarchy, or what he calls a feararchy. And setting boundaries and saying no triggers the two at the very top of the pyramid: fear of separation and fear of ego death. Now, the fear of separation speaks to a deep-rooted desire to avoid abandonment and rejection. And we as humans have a very strong need to belong. And from an evolutionary perspective, when an early human was kicked out of the tribe, they would have likely died. So on a very deep, deep level, we feel threatened by knowing that someone is upset with us or doesn't like us. And when we talk about saying no and setting boundaries, people will often say, I suffer from people pleasing. But the fact is that we all do. It's in our DNA. It's just that some people have learned to control the response more than others. So we'll talk about a few tips for people pleasing to start off, and awareness is the biggest key. So when we're aware, our prefrontal cortex can override our limbic system, and then you can choose how to respond. So it might take some practice, but it's definitely possible as you start to become aware of when this is happening to you. Second tip is, when we're not fully comfortable saying no, we often give a lot of excuses and explanation. So practice saying no and keeping it brief, not harsh, but just sort of matter of fact and brief. And again, sometimes it takes a bit of practice. So just sort of test it out and see what happens and see if the response that you get is actually what you were expecting, or is it actually maybe less dramatic than you thought it might be. And then a third tip is, saying no is harder for some people than others. So if it's something that's really challenging for you, start with something small and with somebody close, somebody safe. And you may even want to practice or see if a friend or family member will role play with you before saying it to a patient. Sometimes that can help just to make you feel more comfortable with it. Okay, back to the Feararchy, or I like to call it a pyramid. I think he missed his opportunity there. But anyway, as this next one is about our universal need to feel lovable, worthy, and of value in the world in order to have healthy relationships with others and with ourselves. So this is strongly related to shame. And physicians often have very strong values related to their work. Saying no to patients can really kind of, bump up against those values and sometimes cause feelings of shame, especially if they're being forced to practice in a way that challenges their integrity. So the public often expects physicians to be kind of superhuman. And I certainly know a lot of physicians who forego lunch and bathroom breaks in their day, their basic needs to provide care for patients. And it's become almost like a culture of self-sacrifice. And that's definitely something that we need to work on and change. And along those lines, this study in the Journal of Emergency Medicine found that shame is created for many students in medical school, and it proliferates once they get into practice. So for some people, that sense of shame around practicing medicine goes way back and is quite deep. So a couple of tips for managing shame. And, these are very high level. Deep shame is definitely something that a therapist has the skills to support. So we're just touching the surface. You might be familiar with shame researcher Brene Brown, and she says, if you put shame in a petri dish, it needs 3 things to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount of shame in a petri dish and douse it with empathy, it can't survive. So the antidote to shame is to talk about it with someone you trust. And certainly it loses its hold when you find out, that other people feel the same way. It's when it's kept in secrecy that it grows. And I know this sounds a little cheesy. It is cheesy for sure. But for some people, having a little mantra that you can say to yourself, if saying no is hard for you, can really help to keep those feelings of shame at bay. So you can see here, I've got one that says, I'm the guardian of my time and energy, and whether you put that on a Post-it note on your mirror so you see it every morning or on your computer, it can help you to just, remind yourself about it's okay to say no. Other ones here we have are I'm allowed to say no and I'm enough just as I am. And I don't know if anyone on the call today needs to hear this, but if you do, this last one is actually very true. You are enough just as you are. And being a physician doesn't mean you have to just give and give. You deserve to have work-life balance just like everyone else. So it's okay to say no and to take care of yourself. So now that we've kind of covered that neurobiological side of things, we'll get into some of the more practical tips that you can work on for setting boundaries and saying no. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, and I know that there are lots of other strategies, and you'll have an opportunity in the breakout rooms to share some of your personal strategies. These are just a few that we'll take a look at, and if you haven't tried them, you might want to try incorporating them. So the first step when you're thinking about starting to set boundaries is to figure out what's most important for you and what are your own priorities. And so in our example physician here, she's thinking that she wants to feel in control of her day. She wants to feel good about the care she's provided for her patients. And she would really like to not feel exhausted at the end of the day. And once you know why you want to set boundaries, you can think about what specific actions you can take to get there. So some boundaries that she might want to work on are saying no to taking on new patients, running on time throughout the day so that she can get home on time, taking an actual 30-minute work-free lunch, and maybe saying no to those last-minute requests that come at the end of the day. So our brains are quite suggestible. So what you say to yourself makes a big difference in how you feel about it. So saying, I have to say no to new patients feels quite different from, I choose to say no to taking new patients so that I feel good about the care I'm providing to my existing patients. So in your own mind, you're kind of always connecting back to your own goals and reasons for doing this. Okay. So when you're making decisions about what to work on in pretty much in any arena, really, it can be helpful to do an impact effort grid. And we've only got 4, but sometimes if you've got a lot of options, it can be helpful to try out, test them out on this grid, and it can help you make a decision. So you can see on the y-axis, it goes from low to high impact, and the x-axis goes from low to high effort. So if our doctor were to plot the 4 potential boundaries to work on, she might decide that taking 30-minute work-free lunches would take high effort, but not really have that much impact on helping her reach her main priorities. So she might decide to shelve that one for now. Not taking end-of-day requests is pretty low effort, but she also decides that it's also pretty low impact. So again, she may want to do that if she's looking for a quick win, or she may want to focus her energy on something with higher impact. So running on time is high impact, but also high effort. So she might want to just hold off on that one for a bit. But not taking on new patients, she's decided is in the lower effort, but high impact category. So that's a pretty good place to start. So that's where she's going to start working on setting boundaries. So back to the patient who is upset and wants her to take on his mother. Our physician really cares, and she wants to say yes to her patient, but she knows that saying yes to a new patient, especially in this case, a complex patient, is going to take up appointments which would have belonged to her current panel. So they may end up going to walk in for care that she could have provided. So she starts by acknowledging how difficult the situation is and briefly explains her responsibility to her current panel. So she says, I understand how frustrating it is to find a doctor right now. I have a responsibility to my current patients and I can't take on anyone new right now. I'm very sorry, but the answer is no. So she's firm but kind. The patient in this case may get upset, and he may continue to push to see if her boundaries are firm. Some people will sort of push and push until they are certain that those boundaries are firm. So it's important to stand your ground. And he may even file a complaint. But our physician has made the right decision, and she can't please everyone. So she's erred on the side of the panel that she's already committed to. And that is the right decision. So it can also help to remember that you can only control your own actions and responses. You might be able to influence the situation by providing a printed sheet of physicians taking on new patients. But the most important thing here is that you're not responsible for this patient's response. You're responsible for keeping your practice at a manageable size so that you can provide, good care for your panel. So it's okay to say no. You can't make everyone happy, and that's okay. And ultimately, really, you're not responsible for this patient's troubles. The system is. So, an individual cannot fix what's going on in the system. One little thing to watch out for is leaky boundaries. We teach people how to treat us. And so if we say no, but then we're talked out of it, people know that they can likely do that again in the future. So even though they may be upset, most people will accept your boundaries. And actually, deep down, they'll probably respect you more for setting and holding them. So now our physician might be ready to try running on time so she can get home for dinner. When she explores the primary sources of challenge, she pinpoints that she has 15 minutes for appointments, and she'd like to use that 10 minutes for the patient and 5 minutes for charting. But she's often in with patients for 20 minutes or more, which really throws off her schedule and means she's doing a lot of her charting in the evening. So this tip is about managing expectations. Patients often don't know how long an appointment is meant to be. And I actually did kind of an unofficial survey, and the most common answer I got was 20 minutes. So patients really just don't have a sense of what is normal, what their appointment time is supposed to be. So, and also the longer a patient sits in the waiting room, the more time they feel entitled to justify their waiting. So running on time kind of begets running on time. And helping the patient to manage expectations just lets them help you to stay on time. So give them the cue by telling them how long the appointment is, and you can sort of work this into conversation. So, in our 10 minutes today, I'd like to talk to you about your hypertension. What's most important to you? Or, what would you like to look at in this 10-minute appointment? Then if the patient has a list, you can review it for related items and decide what can be managed in the 10 minutes and what will require another appointment. All right. So this next part is a strategy that can help in some instances, and it recognizes that the patient is the expert of their experience, expert in their symptoms, and you're the expert in how to treat them. And so it involves reframing the patient's issues into something that you can say yes to. So something you initially would want to say no to, but you can reframe it so you're actually saying yes. So in this case, a patient comes in and she says, I have a bad cold and I need some antibiotics. So initially, you might have a strong response to that, but you just kind of set that response aside. And in this case, our physician has said, agrees, colds are the worst. I understand how frustrating it is when you don't feel well, and you just want something that will help. So she's acknowledging where the patient is. The second step is to mirror the patient to help develop that understanding. So our patient says, I feel awful all the time, with everything going on. And our physician says, everything going on? So she literally mirrors the patient just by using the last 3 words that she said. And the patient will go on to explain a little bit, and it will feel like the physician really understands where she's coming from. Then comes the reframing of the solution. So the key here is to be confident in your assessment of the examination findings while validating the patient's experience of their symptoms. So in this case, our physician isn't disagreeing with the patient about the antibiotics. This is more of a meeting of 2 experts. So the patient came in asking for antibiotics, but what they ultimately want is relief from discomfort. So our physician says, your chest sounded clear, but when I looked at your throat, there was a lot of inflammation. I can see that it must have been very sore. By treating you with anti-inflammatory medication, we'll be able to relieve that soreness. So again, saying yes, but not to the antibiotics. Okay, so I want to get us into the breakout rooms because, again, I know there are lots of strategies that that people are using and lots of great ones that you can share. So just a final thought before we do that. And we teach people how to treat us by what we allow, and we stop at what we stop and what we reinforce. So setting boundaries and saying no can sometimes be difficult, but ultimately it's really important and worth a bit of practice. If you're interested in a little more reading, there's a couple books. So again, Brene Brown, researcher into shame, she has a few books. One of them, Braving the Wilderness, might be one that you're interested in. And then there's a newer book by a Canadian physician, Gillian Horton, and she wrote kind of a memoir of her own sort of journey through burnout in medicine and how she found her way back, called We're All Perfectly Fine. So 2 books you might want to consider. So we're going to move into our breakout rooms and your questions. And again, the breakout can go wherever it takes you. But if you were wanting to kind of be guided by questions, you can use what, if anything, resonated for you in the session. Do you have any stories or helpful tips that you can share? And then what actions are you considering as a result of today for yourself or for supporting others? And I'm just going to pop those into the chat for you so you can see them when you get in there. All right.